She was 22 years old, and she owned nothing in this world but a cracked leather satchel, a change of clothes, and a small pair of cobbler's awls wrapped in a piece of chamois cloth. That was everything. That was the whole of it. And with the last $30 she had to her name, she bought the ruins of an old tannery on the edge of a dying river town in the Blue Ridge foothills. A place the locals crossed the street to avoid, a place that had not seen a living soul in 11 years. Everyone in Harlan's Ferry said the land was poison. They said it in the quiet, certain way that people say things they have repeated so many times they no longer remember where the story began. What they did not know, what nobody knew, was what Wren Calloway would find buried beneath the rotted floor of the drying shed. And when she found it, it would not just change her life, it would change the way the whole town understood its own history. If you've ever believed that the places most people walk away from are sometimes exactly where someone else needs to arrive, stay with us. This is Wren's story. Wren Calloway was born in the spring in a narrow 2-story house on the far side of Harlan's Ferry. The kind of house that always smelled faintly of pipe smoke and linseed oil, no matter how many windows you opened. Her mother, Ruth, had been a woman of easy laughter and quick hands, a woman who could mend a boot sole or recane a chair's seat without ever looking up from whatever story she was telling. Ruth died of pneumonia when Wren was 9, and the house went quiet in the way that a room goes quiet after a door has been shut somewhere far away. Her father, Wren Calloway, was a decent man undone by grief. He took a second wife 3 years later, a woman named Harriet, who ran the household like a business she had not wanted to acquire. Harriet was not cruel in any dramatic way. She was simply indifferent, which for a child already learning to take up as little space as possible was its own particular kind of cruelty. The place Wren found her footing was a narrow workshop behind the hardware store, belonging to an old cordwainer named August Finch. August Finch was 71, stooped at the shoulders, and nearly stone-deaf in his left ear. But his hands were the steadiest Wren had ever seen. He repaired boots and saddle leather for the whole county, and he did it with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. He did not advertise. He did not need to. He had noticed Wren the way quiet people notice quiet things, without making a production of it. She had taken to sitting on the back step of his workshop on her way home from school, listening to the rhythmic tap of his mallet through the screen door. One afternoon, he simply set a scrap of vegetable-tanned cowhide and a blunt awl on the step beside her and went back inside. She sat with them for a long time before she picked them up. What followed was 7 years of slow, thorough education. August Finch taught her the feel of good leather, the way full-grain hides had a warmth under the fingers that split leather never quite matched. He showed her how to read the temper of a hide by the way it resisted her thumbnail, and how to sharpen a head knife on a leather strop until the edge would shave the hair from your forearm. Without a sound, he taught her to skive seams thin and even, to saddle stitch with 2 needles in the old way that never unraveled even if a thread broke, and to burnish an edge with a piece of antler bone until it was as smooth and dark as river water. He was not a warm man in any conventional sense. He did not offer compliments. But there was a day, when Wren was 16, that she stitched a welt onto a boot sole so cleanly that he held it up to the light of the window for almost a full minute, turning it slowly. He didn't say anything. He just set it back down on the bench and gave one small nod, the brim of his hat dipping just slightly forward. She carried that nod with her for years. On her 18th birthday, he gave her a pair of cobbler's awls he had made himself. The shafts were fine Sheffield steel, and the handles were turned from a piece of black walnut from his own yard, worn to a deep gloss from decades of use. They had been his mother's before they were his. He wrapped them in a piece of chamois and pressed them into her hands without ceremony, the way you hand someone a key. She kept them in her satchel always after that. August Finch passed in the early spring of Wren's 22nd year quietly, in his sleep, the way people said he would. He left the workshop to a nephew in Asheville who had no interest in cobbling and sold the whole contents at auction inside of a month. The workshop was gone. The step where she had sat and listened was gone. The work that had been the center of her days was gone. And then, 2 weeks after the funeral, Harriet sat her down at the kitchen table and slid an envelope across to her. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed with a date at the top. Wren read it. Read it again. It was a notice from a county housing authority. Harriet had put in for a transfer of the deed on the house. Wren Calloway had signed it. There was a paragraph near the bottom explaining that Wren's occupancy of the secondary bedroom would terminate at the end of the month. She looked up. Her father was standing in the doorway to the hall, not quite in the room. He was looking at the wall just to the left of her face. His expression was the expression of a man waiting for a train that was already pulling away. There were no words adequate to the moment. Wren had learned from August Finch that when a material cannot be repaired, you do not force it. You set it aside, and you find a different piece to work with. She folded the letter along its original crease. She put it back in the envelope. She took her satchel from the hook by the back door, the one with the chamois-wrapped awls at the bottom, and she walked out without a word. The road she took led west, toward the river. We should tell you something about Harlan's Ferry. It is a town that has been slowly untethering from the world for the better part of 40 years. The old textile mill closed in the 80s, the hardware store after that. What remained was a gas station, a diner that changed hands every few years, and a post office that kept irregular hours. It was the kind of town where people stayed not because it was easy, but because they had roots too old and deep to pull up without taking something vital with them. Wren had grown up in the ferry town, but had never fully belonged to it. Now she walked its main street with $30 in her pocket and no particular destination, looking at the for sale signs in windows with the focused attention of a person who has run out of alternatives. The old tannery at the south end of Birch Road was not for sale. It was not anything. It had simply been sitting there, decaying on a quarter-acre of floodplain land, since the Holt family had abandoned it 11 years prior. The county had held the tax lien so long that the clerk who processed the paperwork had retired and been replaced twice over. Wren found out about it not from a listing, but from a conversation in the diner. She was nursing a cup of coffee she'd stretched as long as she reasonably could when she overheard two older men at the counter, talking about the Holt place. "No one's touching that land," said one of them, a man with a postal service jacket. "Not since what happened." "What happened?" she asked. The two men looked at her. "You're Wren Calloway's girl," the postal worker said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. He told her then in the economical way of men who have told a story many times. The Holt family had run the tannery for 3 generations. Good work, good people. Then Warren Holt's son, the one who'd inherited the operation, had borrowed against the property to fund an expansion right before the bottom fell out of the regional leather market. He couldn't service the debt, lost the equipment first, then the building, then his family to the stress of it. Warren himself had died before the foreclosure finalized, sitting in that drying shed, they said, with his hands on his knees and his eyes open. People said the land held his disappointment the way leather holds water. It warped everything. "How much does the county want for it?" Wren asked. The postal worker looked at her like she'd asked something mildly dangerous. $30, last time anyone checked, just to clear the lien. She left exact change on the counter for her coffee, picked up her satchel, and walked to the county office. The clerk who handled the transaction, a small, precise woman named Viola Dent, looked at Wren's $30 on the counter and then looked at Wren herself. She did not say anything unnecessary. She stamped the deed, had Wren sign twice, and handed her a carbon copy. "You know what you're getting into?" Viola Dent asked. "Not entirely," Wren said. Viola Dent nodded slowly, as if this were the most honest answer she had heard all week. "Good luck to you then." The tannery was not visible from Birch Road. You came to it through a gap in the wild privet hedge, down a short slope to where the land flattened near the river. It was a complex of 3 structures: the main processing barn, long since caved in on the eastern end, a small office building with its windows boarded over, and the drying shed, which was the most intact of the 3, its walls still standing, its metal roof rusted but unbroken. Wren stood at the edge of the property. For a long time the deed folded in her pocket. Others saw rot and liability. She saw the bones of a place that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. The shed's corner posts were old-growth chestnut, a wood so dense that it outlasted almost everything. The main beams were hand-hewn, mortised and pegged without a single nail at the joints. Whoever had built this place had built it to stand. She pushed open the door of the drying shed and stepped inside. The smell was deep and mineral, old tannin and river damp, the ghost of hides processed long ago, the sweet rot of the wooden floor. Light came in through gaps in the wall boards in long angled columns, full of floating dust. In the far corner, someone had left a stack of old bark, oak and chestnut, the tan bark used in the vats. It had turned to something almost like soil. She ran her hand along the interior wall and felt the old plaster, lime over horsehair, still firm in most places. She pressed her heel against the floorboards and felt only one give beneath her foot. One bad section near the south wall. She was already calculating, already planning. The first week was the hardest physically. She slept in the intact half of the office building, on a folded moving blanket she found in the processing barn, and she worked from first light until she could no longer see. She had no power tools, no generator. She had August Finch's awls, a hand drill she bought at the salvage yard in the next town for $4, a hammer, and her own considered judgment about which problems to address in which order. She started with the floor of the drying shed. The bad section was worse than she'd thought once she pulled the boards back. The sill plate beneath had partially rotted from water intrusion. Through a gap in the foundation stones, she spent a full day carefully removing the damaged boards, each one numbered in chalk so she could account for them, and then began the patient work of cutting out the soft wood from the sill and packing the gap in the foundation with a mix of hydraulic lime and river sand, the closest she could come with available materials to the original mortar. It was close, painstaking work. She did it right. It was on the second day of this repair, when she was pulling the last of the damaged boards from the subfloor, that she found it. Wedged between the old sill plate and a rough stone footing, in a space no wider than her forearm, was a small tin box. The lid was sealed with paraffin wax, cracked but mostly intact, which had kept the moisture out for what must have been decades. Her hands were steady when she opened it. August Finch had taught her that your hands don't rush good work. Inside was a folded oilskin packet, and inside the oilskin was a sheaf of papers, handwritten in a tight, careful script, and a small brass thimble, the kind a tailor uses, engraved on the outer rim with a pattern of tiny vines. The papers were dry. The thimble was tarnished but perfect. She carried them to the doorway where the light was better and sat down on the threshold. The papers were dated across a span of years, from 1931 to 1943. They were written by a woman named Clara Holt. She was Warren Holt's grandmother. She had been, from the evidence of these pages, a woman of extraordinary industry. The early entries described the tannery in its working years, the rhythms of the vats, the smell of the tannic acid, the particular light of October mornings when the hides hung to dry in the shed and turned the color of old honey. Clara wrote about leather the way August Finch had handled it, with deep professional love. But about a third of the way through the sheaf, the tone shifted. The depression had come for the tannery as it had come for everything. Her husband, Emmett, had tried to hold on. The entries became shorter, more compressed. There were references to debts, to buyers who didn't come, to hides that couldn't be sold. But threaded through even the darkest of these pages was something else. A secondary accounting, columns of careful figures, amounts deposited in a different kind of economy. Clara had continued to work through the worst years. Not tanning. There was no market for that. She had returned to a skill she'd had before her marriage, before the tannery. She had been a seamstress of exceptional quality. She had taken in repair work from every household within 20 miles. Coat linings, wedding dresses, the good wool suits that men wore to funerals and had to last another decade. She had done this quietly, methodically, and she had documented every dollar. Near the end of the papers, she had written this: "I am setting aside what I have saved apart from the tannery's books so that Emmett will not feel obligated to use it for debts that are not mine to settle. It is enough to begin again. I do not know yet what beginning again will look like, but I have learned that the materials always tell you if you are patient enough to listen. Whoever finds this after me, this money is not a debt. It is a starting point. Use it for work you believe in. That is all any money is really for." Tucked behind the last page were $46 in Depression-era bills and a postal money order for $60, drawn on a bank that had long since been absorbed into another and then another. But the money order itself, Wren would later learn from Viola Dent at the county office, was honored by the successor institution as a matter of historical record. She had to fill out a form, but they honored it, $106 in total. She sat on the threshold of the drying shed. For a long time, the papers in her lap, the brass thimble turned between her fingers. The shed smelled of old tannin and river air. Outside, the late afternoon light fell through the privet hedge in long green bars. This place was not cursed. It had never been cursed. It had simply been carrying grief that no one had stayed long enough to understand. The grief of a family that had tried, and tried honestly, and had still lost. Warren Holt's defeat had become the town's mythology. But Clara Holt's survival, her quiet, stubborn refusal to let the hardest years be the defining ones, had been forgotten entirely. Wren held the thimble and thought about August Finch. She thought about the chamois-wrapped awls at the bottom of her satchel. She thought about small, precise tools and what they meant. Clara had sewed her way through disaster with a thimble and needle. and she had done it without anyone's notice or permission. There were things Wren understood about that. She went back to work. The discovery changed the shape of what was possible. It was not just the money, though the money allowed her to buy materials she had not been able to afford. Lime plaster, new floorboards from the salvage yard, a second-hand wood stove for the office building, which was rapidly becoming her actual living space. It was the sense of inheritance the letter gave her. She was not trespassing here. She was being trusted. Her first finished project in the tannery was a small leather repair shop set up in one corner of the drying shed. She brought her tools, August's awls, the head knife she'd bought at auction, a steel edge and a finishing bone, and she tacked a single hand-lettered card to the private hedge at the road. Lather repair, Wren Calloway, price is fair. She was not prepared for the response. The first person to come was a woman named Lucinda Moss, a retired schoolteacher from the far end of Birch Road, who brought a purse with a broken strap that had belonged to her mother. She did not leave when Wren finished the repair. She stayed, watching with the attentive interest of someone rediscovering something they'd forgotten they missed. "You stitch like you mean it," Lucinda Moss said. "My teacher was particular," Wren said. That was the beginning. People came with boots that had separated from their soles, belts worn through at the keeper, saddle leather, cracked from neglect, an old briefcase whose handle had torn free. Each thing that came to her had been on the verge of being thrown away. Each thing left repaired and functional, and in most cases, better than it had been in years. Word moved through Harlan's Ferry, the way word moves through a small town, not through any single announcement, but through the accumulation of small endorsements. Lucinda Moss mentioned Wren to the woman at the post office. The woman at the post office told her husband, who brought in a pair of field boots he'd been meaning to re-sole for 3 years. He picked them up on a Thursday and wore them to the hardware store on Friday, and when someone asked about them, he said, "Girl out at the old tannery fixed them. Does good work." Viola Dent came in with a leather-bound ledger whose spine had split. She was the county clerk, and the ledger was an official record book, and she had been quietly anxious about it for months. Wren rebuilt the spine with a strip of new veg tan, using the original holes so the stitching matched the interior binding. She had it ready in 2 days. Viola Dent looked at the finished work for a long moment. "How did you learn to do this?" "August Finch," Wren said. Viola Dent went still. "I knew August Finch," she said. "He repaired my grandmother's Bible cover. I was a girl." She paused. "He was the best craftsman in this county." "Yes," Wren said simply. "He was." They did not say anything else, but when Viola Dent left, she turned at the gap in the private hedge. "I'll tell people about you," she said. It was a practical statement, not an emotional one. But Wren understood it for the offering it was. She was finding slowly that Harlan's Ferry was not so different from the tannery itself. Beneath the surface decay, beneath the accumulation of years of difficulty and departure, there was structure. There were people who had stayed and put down roots and built lives the best way they knew how. They had simply stopped expecting to be surprised. They had stopped expecting things to come back to life when they saw the smoke rising from the tannery's chimney in the mornings. Wren had restored the old flue with new firebrick. They started walking down Birch Road to see what was happening, and when they found a young woman with calloused hands and steady eyes doing careful work in a building they'd written off, something in them responded to it in a way they might not have been able to name. Lucinda Moss started coming by on Tuesday afternoons. She brought tea in a thermos and sat in the chair Wren had set out for customers, and she talked about the history of the town with the organized clarity of a woman who had been a teacher for 30 years. She told Wren about the tannery in its working years. She told her about the Holt family, and about Warren, who had been a decent man crushed by circumstances, and about his grandmother Clara, who had been, sharp as a tack, Lucinda said, and twice as useful. "She made my mother's wedding dress, 1938. It was still in the family until the house fire in 79. Wren was quiet for a moment, turning a finished awl handle in her fingers. Then she told Lucinda about the tin box. Lucinda was silent for a long time when Wren finished. "Clara Holt," she said finally. "All those years people talked about the tannery like it was a cautionary tale. And she was in there the whole time, just doing the work and saving the money and writing it all down." She shook her head slowly. "Nobody tells that part of the story." "I think," Wren said, "that's usually the way it goes." There was one item she placed on the small shelf she'd built above her work table, in the corner of the drying shed where the light was best. On the left side of the shelf sat August Finch's awls, still wrapped in their chamois cloth, tools she used every day and cleaned every evening. On the right side sat Clara Holt's brass thimble. She had polished it with a bit of leather cream until the vine pattern on the rim was clear again. They looked right, together. Two tools from two different lives, in a place that had needed exactly both of them. She kept Clara's letters in the tin box, which she'd cleaned and resealed. She had made one copy of each letter on the county office copier. Viola Dent had waived the copying fee, and she'd given the copies to the local historical society for the record. The originals stayed in the shed, where they had been found. They belonged here. The first real winter in the tannery came in late November, with a cold that settled into the river valley like a judgment. Wren's wood stove burned steadily from 4 in the morning until she banked it at night. The shed was warm enough to work in with a wool sweater. The walls she'd replastered held the heat in a way the previous owner would have recognized. Old lime plaster was better insulation than most people remembered. One evening, with the stove banked and a lamp on the work table, she sat finishing the last of a set of leather tool rolls she'd made to order for a potter in the next town. Her hands moved through the work the way water moves through a familiar channel. Outside, the wind moved through the privet hedge, and somewhere down the road a dog was barking at something that had startled it in the dark. And inside the shed, there was only the clean smell of good leather and the small sounds of needle through hide. She thought about her father's house, the house that had stood so still and quiet after her mother died, the house that had never quite remembered how to be warm. She thought about Harriet and the county notice, and the way her father had stood in the doorway, looking at the wall. She did not feel bitterness when she thought of it now. Bitterness required believing you had been owed something that was withheld. She had come to understand that her father had not withheld anything deliberately. He had simply had nothing left to give. After grief took what it took. That was his tragedy, not his crime. What she felt instead was the quiet certainty of someone who has found the right place for the work August Finch had put into her hands, and Clara Holt's letters had given context to, and this valley, this difficult, stubbornly living little valley, had provided the ground for. She had arrived here with $30 and an awl and no particular plan. The tannery had given her structure. Clara Holt had given her precedent. Lucinda Moss and Viola Dent, and the man with the field boots and the slow accumulation of people who brought their broken things and left with them mended. They had given her belonging. Not family in the blood sense. Something built more deliberately than that. The way you build a wall from river stone. Each piece chosen, each piece placed, each piece holding the weight of the next. She reached out and touched the brass thimble on the shelf. Cool and solid and present. A thing that had survived because Clara Holt had thought to protect it, had thought to write everything down, had believed, against all evidence of those hard years, that someone would come and the work would continue. The work had continued. Outside, the wind was running along the river. Inside the drying shed of the old Holt tannery on Birch Road, the stove ticked warmly, and the lamp held its ground against the dark, and Wren Calloway, 22 years old, no longer without a place, no longer without a purpose, drew her needle through good leather and listened to the sound of her own life coming quietly, solidly, home. Wren arrived at that tannery with $30 to her name and the weight of August Finch's tools in her satchel. And in the end, that was exactly enough to begin. If this story of finding solid ground in a place others had given up on stayed with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it. And we'll leave you with this. What broken thing in your life, or in someone else's, has been waiting for the right pair of hands to find it worth repairing?